In a world where reality and imagination blur, there's a phenomenon that's capturing attention and causing distress. It all began with a booklet that misidentified extraordinary dreams as evidence of alien encounters. Published in 1992, this booklet unwittingly sparked a wave of confusion and anxiety among those who read it. Individuals who are schizotypal, fantasy-prone, or susceptible to hypnosis are particularly vulnerable to Alien Abduction Believer Syndrome, AABS. Alien Abduction BS Believer Syndrome is defined by harm perpetuated by the 1992 Unusual Personal Experiences booklet, exposure to alien abduction narratives, encounter with the media of John Mack, Bud Hopkins, or David Jacobs, fear, anxiety, or PTSD related to alien abduction narratives, or susceptibility to contemporary UAP crash retrieval narratives that are derived from the funding or work of Robert Bigelow. The consequences of alien abduction believer syndrome can be devastating, often leading to symptoms similar to PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. But there's a subtle form of AABS that's emerging in contemporary times. Some individuals find themselves drawn to narratives of contemporary UAP crash retrievals, falling into a similar pattern of belief and distress. Yet, amidst the false memories and confusion, there's a crucial point to remember. The underlying cause of extraordinary dreams may indicate encounters beyond our understanding. As we grapple with the complexities of the mind and the mysteries of the universe, let's approach each other with compassion and understanding. Together, we can navigate the shadows of belief and find truth in our shared humanity. Let's work together to unravel the mysteries of the mind and embrace a more nuanced understanding of our experiences. With knowledge and compassion, we can navigate the complexities of belief and find clarity in the search for truth. Learn more today and schedule a free consultation at D-SETI.org. This is a presentation of D-SETI, the dream search for extraterrestrial intelligence. This is called Alien Abduction Believer Syndrome, AABS. So this is all about my inquiry to discover what was the cause of my 1990s traumatizing fear of alien abduction. I say it was and is the Alien Abduction Believer Syndrome, AABS. So the definition of Alien Abduction Believer Syndrome: it's a complex of symptoms related to belief in a quasi-religious ET UFO narrative, specifically the alien abduction narratives as defined by the UFO Abduction Syndrome and propagated in the 1992 Unusual Personal Experiences booklet. UAP crash retrieval narratives as characterized by the 2017 New York Times article and Bigelow involvement, the 2023 UFO whistleblower media campaign, and the UAP Disclosure Act of 2023. It is associated with fantasy proneness, hypnotic suggestibility, and schizotypy. It's characterized by lifelike fear and anxiety of ET-NHI encounters, presenting with reality confusion similar to false awakening or sleep paralysis dreams, which may result in PTSD. It is derived from the epistemological fallacies of the myth of repressed memory and the monophasic bias. We're going to go through each part of the definition in this presentation. So I'm simply just introducing this as a way of a roadmap, let's say. I need to give some context to where we're at. So this presentation derives from an inquiry I've been going on. And you can see this is my YouTube video history. About 12 videos ago, I make a video called 2017 plus UAP crash retrievals in 1990s alien abduction. Same story, different decade. In that video, I really track the literary ties, let's say, between the early 1990s abduction research of John Mack, Bud Hopkins, and David Jacobs, which was funded by Robert Bigelow and the Prince of Liechtenstein. I I track that to modern day contemporary UAP disclosure narratives, primarily through the involvement of Robert Bigelow in both cases, the reporting of Leslie Kean, who was lover and protege of Bud Hopkins, and Ralph Blumenthal, the biographer of John Mack. So I say there's very specific ties. We see those ties coming through in the claims made by Danny Sheehan. So I produced a couple videos about the myth of repressed memory and the claims he was making, which are, I believe, ridiculous, primarily around the notion of abduction. He made claims that John Mack never performed hypnosis. John Mack did perform hypnosis, and he's making those claims to distance himself from the myth of repressed memory, distance the UAP disclosure narrative from the myth of repressed memory. But actually, it's simply just a reiteration. Myth of repressed memory says you can use extraordinary therapy techniques like hypnosis to reduce anxieties or other things that are preventing you from remembering long-forgotten trauma of space alien sexual violations, basically, is what he's saying. And he says he's influenced the UAP Disclosure Act of 2023. So I really deep dived into that. From there, I produced a video called The Cause of the UFO Abduction Syndrome that really dives into the book, The Unusual Personal Experiences. We'll dive through that a little bit. We'll provide a sense of context because what I'm presenting here is a satire of that work. In this video, I compare the key indicators of the UFO abduction syndrome. These are things like, have you seen a ghost? Have you dreamed of a UFO? Do you have missing time? That sort of thing. I looked through those key indicators and I compared those key indicators with prevalence rates of known dreams from a database of 200,000 dreams to really see what are false awakening dreams like, what are alien dreams like, and I came to some conclusions there. From there, I asked the question, where is the physical evidence for alien abduction experience and why do people keep saying it exists? So I wrote a book, The Field Guide to Anomalous Geometry. I collected dozens of examples of anomalous geometric body marks in association with extraterrestrial intuitions. People might have a dream and then discover a strange mark on their body. And so I looked at those and I tried to find patterns and I tried to discern what's going on. And I came to the conclusion that unless there is a scientific hypothesis about the physical mechanics of that mark, it must be understood as an omen or an anomaly. And we might work with that in the same way we work with things like stigmata or other spiritual omens. But unless there is a physical, scientific hypothesis that has collected the data regarding the body marks, those body marks cannot and should not be used as physical evidence for any supernatural hypothesis. From there, I move into the lurid secret history of alien abduction research. And this is really where I understand why and how we started to believe there was physical evidence for alien abduction when there was none. This relies on the observation by a 1999 Village Voice article about Bud Hopkins. It says that he carried around a scrapbook of weird photographs of body marks. And that included pictures of private parts like a perforated labia and other strange marks. And so he would take this scrapbook and he would show it as evidence for physical alien abduction. And I believe he did so with the early abduction researchers in the 80s and 90s. He would show these photographs to perhaps John Mack and the researchers of this abduction research and say, oh, wow, look at this. This was caused by a zeta reticulin doing bad medicine, or this was caused by a mantid doing this, that, the other thing, or this was caused by a screen memory. He would tell these fantastic stories at the same time as showing these almost lurid photographs of intimate parts that have been mutilated in specific ways. I'm not suggesting any intentional harm. I'm suggesting he inadvertently hypnotized a generation of alien abduction researchers to believe there was physical evidence when really there was just a scrapbook of weird body marks carried around by Bud Hopkins. So you can really see that happen actually for about 5 years. John Mack claims or repeats the claims there's overwhelming physical evidence for abduction, and then he wises up to it. I make a tribute to John Mack about all of these things because most of his tributes are very, very positive, and I say almost one-sided. And so even his biography by Blumenthal called him the believer, and that was a sort of admission into a sense of almost fault of going across the line in terms of believing. But there wasn't really a negative tribute to him from what I've seen. So I thought, I need to put out this notion that we can have these saints of our community, let's say the forefathers of the experiencer communities, they can have both positive and negative legacies, and that's okay. I share the example of my dad, who was a charismatic man, well-educated, who likewise had a positive and negative legacy. He was both an alcoholic and a sex addict, and it broke apart our family. And yet I credit him for much of my art interests, much of my philosophy interests. So I say there's positive and negative legacy to be had in relationship to John Mack. In that, I received polarizing responses, obviously, because it's a polarizing thing to say. One of the insults I received or responses suggested that my arguments were like a chatbot, and that was the cause of me looking into ChatGPT. That was what produced the intro to this video, was a ChatGPT request to produce a script for a public service announcement about the Alien Abduction Believer Syndrome. From there, I asked questions to the John E. Mack Institute, like, is it reasonable to believe in the UFO Abduction Syndrome? Did John Mack ever consult with known experts on hypnosis and dreams? Basically asked all the questions one would need to establish his early 1990s research, particularly his endorsement of the UFO Abduction Syndrome in the Unusual Personal Experiences booklet as harmful pseudoscience. So I asked all those questions in order to establish that ground in my mind. And that brings us to this moment here, where I'm presenting on the results or the conclusion of this rather lengthy and somewhat strange and arduous inquiry. So I need to offer some disclaimers. Every single slide here on the bottom says satire of the UFO Abduction Syndrome defined in 1992 Unusual Personal Experiences booklet, see disclaimers. This is really to say that I have used the Unusual Personal Experiences booklet as a literary example by which to construct a literary satire that puts forward my arguments. And so that's really what's going on here. No accusations of harm are being made. This is satire, inquiry, and thought experimentation. Yes, I am thinking about unusual personal experiences as potentially harmful pseudoscience, but my jury is not out, let's say. I have not yet closed the books or made a decision. In fact, by the end of this presentation, I will likely advocate that it is not harmful pseudoscience. I think it's important for us to go through that journey of exploring whether or not it is harmful pseudoscience, because it establishes where is the stable ground upon which to stand when we study ET-NHI encounters. This is documentation of an inquiry. It's not yet a final statement. I would want that final statement to be reviewed by other people. And at the end of this inquiry, I've redone this presentation many times and might do so again before it's released. I make the presentations first, then write them up as a creative process. My primary method is critical literature review. If you don't like what I have to say, you can read through my arguments and you can read through the references and say where I'm off in my logic or reference citations or anything like that. But please know it is a critical literature review. I am basing all of the things I say upon literature, from literature databases or from the unusual personal experiences that I'm looking into. It's crafted from my arguments around the 1992 Unusual Personal Experiences booklet. I keep saying that because it's really important to know this is grounded in literature. I'm not a lawyer. This is not a legal argument. I'm not a psychiatrist. This is not a psychiatry or clinical in nature. I will use some clinical-like language, primarily because I'm satirizing a document that presented a clinical definition and therapy recommendations in a pseudoscientific way. I am a scholar and a dream worker. This is a literary argument informed by creative dream work practice. The arguments and facts need to be double and triple checked. It seems unbelievable to me that Bigelow sent unusual personal experiences to 100,000 mental health practitioners. It's unbelievable to me that Mack or Jemmy never published a statement against the UFO Abduction Syndrome definition. It seems unbelievable to me that Mack's epistemological fallacies influenced the UAP Disclosure Act of 2023 through Danny Sheehan, and yet that's what he claims he's done. So I want to just reflect briefly on two omens on the journey to define alien abduction believer syndrome. The first omen was a trapped mouse. I've been writing these slides and working on these slides. One day when I thought I would, when I completed the first draft of these slides, I came up to work in the morning and I had this beautiful dream of reading to children. There was a woman actually reading to children in like an elementary school in a beautiful kind of forest school type situation. So I wake up, I come up to my office, which has a trap door in the ceiling that I bring down the ladder and climb up to. A mouse had been trapped and it flopped around until it landed on the trap door. I open it up, the mouse falls down onto the floor and flips around. I pick it up in a bucket and I throw it down the hill. I freak out. I don't know what to do. I talk to my wife about it, and she says, that seems like an omen. I say, what's the omen? What would you think I should do in this situation? Well, she says, well, I think you're right in that you shouldn't have bashed it because that would have been too violent for you. But drowning it would have really killed it and solved the problem. And so I thought, oh my God, I have to actually drown the mouse of this argument. So the trapped mouse for me represented my argument against alien abduction, physical alien abduction hypotheses. And yes, I know that there's been lots of arguments against them, but nobody actually argued against alien abduction hypothesis in a way that honored my lived experience as someone who believed they were abducted by aliens or possibly could have been. I experienced extraordinary dream phenomena that I had no other concepts to interpret except by alien abduction hypothesis. So that's why I'm flipping around in my head. When I asked those questions to the John Mack Institute, I felt like I trapped the mouse in my head of alien abduction. It's been flipping around ever since. And so I said, I need to drown this. The process of producing these presentations, I think, has drowned it in my head. Or else released it into the forest. In any ways, it's resolved. I'm not sure what that means, but we'll tune into that. The second omen actually was around the transmutation of suffering or evolution of suffering to evolution to joy and creativity. I've been talking to Robin Lassiter, who's the community manager of the Experiencer Group. She has a podcast, she has a book, she has been written by Ralph Blumenthal, who held her up as a sort of example of a modern day abductee. So I've been talking to her about my recent book, Galithog the Gray's Field Guide to Anomalous Geometry, in part because she inspired it. I went on her podcast to promote Missing Time Found and talked about some things and did some research, and that inspired, I go, I need to write a book on body marks. And so she's been reviewing that, but she went off to a retreat in the American Southwest where she drove around in a truck where she's camping in back of, and she was looking up at the sky and reflecting upon UFOs to a voice recorder. So she's recording her reflections as she was driving around the American Southwest looking at UFOs, thinking about UFOs, and she published it in a podcast episode. Now, I did the exact same thing in 2013, except I never published my reflections. I looked up at the sky, thought about UFOs, reflected as I drove around in my truck that I camped in back of in the American Southwest. So I said, whatever she says has to be an omen for me. And I really just decided at that moment that it would be an omen. And so the words that came through were bridge, which we'll talk about at the end, and this sense of evolution through suffering, transmuting and becoming evolution to joy and creativity. So that's what I've been doing. This whole journey for me started with anger, hurt, and suffering. I was triggered in this journey, particularly when I realized the impactful nature of the 1992 Unusual Personal Experiences booklet, as well as the fact no one's addressed it, as well as the fact that there's the 2011 article, Priests of High Strangeness, that really condemns abduction research, but no one told me about that. All sorts of stuff I was angry about. But I have read and reworked this argument many, many times. This is probably the 15th hour I've presented this argument to my computer. And I'm hoping that this argument has finally received a level of purity in terms of my emotional presence, my mindful presence, where I have transmuted all of that anger and hurt and suffering, because I don't want that to come through. That just triggers people, and it's not effective to my argument, actually. And the thing that I really want to say is that we can move through the challenges of alien abduction believer syndrome together, and it can really happen. And that I'm sharing my testimony and working and reworking that because of that. So I shifted on a definition of harm, so that you'll see I talk about my arguments as potentially a harmful pseudoscience, that alien abduction is potentially a harmful pseudoscience. And I say, no, actually, we need to focus more on resolution than on the harm caused. And I say that because unless anyone's really coming forward with a lot of harm, I'm testifying that personally I experienced harm around this, but that working with these notions has really transmuted that very, very quickly for me. I'm hopeful about everything, even abduction and disclosure narratives. That's really where I'm at now. I'm hopeful about everything. That includes things like climate change and our societal collapse and stuff like that, because we are on the brink of something immense and great. And it is something like free energy technologies coming to us from UFO craft. However, I say that the UFO craft actually will not resolve into physical objects we can re-engineer. Rather, all of those experiences invite us into deeper dialogical relationship with extraterrestrials and non-human intelligences and the vast realm of subtle beings that surround us, who have a history of offering us technical, societal, scientific, innovative innovations, creativities, through dreams. So through dreams, we interact with a realm that really solves problems for us and provides creative solutions. And I say that the solutions that we can discern through engaging our dreams and dreamlike experiences might be akin to re-engineering technology from crashed UFO craft. Right. While I describe harm through the alien abduction believer syndrome, I ultimately argue it may open society to transrational means of inquiry and development that is a new paradigm. So we need to go through the relevant literature. This is a literary argument, so I've based it in literature, and I've kind of put the highlights here in a timeline so that you know where I'm coming from and you know where to go to understand my references. Now, I've written up a piece about the alien abduction believer syndrome, and it contains a lot of references too, so you can get to that on my website in the links below. This is the relevant literature timeline. 1981, Missing Time by Bud Hopkins. 1987, UFO Abductions by Bullard. 1992, Unusual Personal Experiences by Bigelow Holding Corporation. This is central to my argument today. 1992, Abduction Study at MIT by Pritchard Mack et al. That I believe is called Alien Discussions in its printed material. 1994, Myth of Repressed Memory by Ketchum and Loftus. 1994, Abduction by Mack. 1996, Towards an Explanation of the UFO Abduction Phenomena, Hypnotic Elaboration, Extraterrestrial Sadomasochism, and Spurious Memories by Newman and Baumeister. 1996, Alleged Alien Abductions, False Memories, Hypnosis and Fantasy Proneness by Lynn and Kirsch. 1999, Passport to the Cosmos by Mack. 2002, Memory Distortions and People Reporting Abduction by Aliens by Clancy et al. 2004, Psychophysiological Responding During Script-Driven Imagery and People Reporting Abduction by Space Aliens by McNally et al. 2011, Priests of High Strangeness by Rainey. Now, if you don't know what that article is, stop what you're doing and follow the links below, or go to the John E. Mack Institute website, search for it. They have a mirrored copy of this article, and it's The Priests of High Strangeness by Carol Rainey, who was the third wife of major abduction researcher Bud Hopkins. He kicked off the whole kind of field in the 80s with his book Missing Time, and produced bestsellers and went all over the place with this notion. But in this article, she really provided damning testimony regarding Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs. Her article really demonstrated that they lost their way. They were no longer performing ethical and integral research, and therefore raises a lot of questions about their earlier work in the whole field of abductology. The skeptics said after this article that abductology imploded. And I wish someone would have let me know when I started studying this again in around 2019, 2020. It took me several years actually to find this article. No one's promoting this as obviously as they're promoting the Bud Hopkins books or David Jacobs. So I think we need to really highlight this as essential to our understanding of alien abduction. 2014, Alien Abduction Experiences and Variety of Anomalous Experiences by Appel et al. 2017, Glowing Auras and Black Money, The Pentagon's Mysterious UFO Program by Cooper, Keene, and Blumenthal. 2019, The Return of the Repressed, The Persistent and Problematic Claims of Long-Forgotten Trauma by Otkar et al. 2021, The Believer by Blumenthal. 2022, Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, Suggestibility, and Disassociation Related to Alleged Alien Abductions by Latore and Basilica. 2023, Intelligence Officials Say U.S. Has Retrieved Craft of Non-Human Origin by Keene and Blumenthal. 2023, Missing Time Found by Rekshan. 2023, UAP Disclosure Act of 2023 by Schumer et al. 2024, Galathog-Legray's Field Guide to Anomalous Geometry by Galathog and Rekshan. So the Unusual Personal Experiences booklet defined the UFO Abduction Syndrome. So I'm going to read from the booklet because that's important to set the context. I argue, right, that this booklet takes the folklorish understanding of abduction. It takes the kind of mass market paperback quality of abduction and moves it into clinical science. And I'll just walk through this document briefly so that you have a grounding in the literature to understand the satire that I'm about to read in my definition of the Alien Abduction Believer Syndrome. So this is Unusual Personal Experiences. It is copyrighted by Bigelow Holding Corporation in 1992. It has commentary by Dr. John Mack, MD. It defines the UFO syndrome. It has the UFO syndrome report that defines the UFO abduction syndrome by Bud Hopkins, David Jacobs, Ron Westrom. Then it introduces their poll that surveyed 6,000 people or so through the Roper organization. They present their findings as well as some observations. Then there's talk of the methodology and the surveys and relationships between different factors and things like that. Then there's commentary by John Carpenter, a licensed clinical social worker. So see, right here we're sandwiching the argument. So the book actually has a core, and that core is called the Unusual Events Survey. This was a poll conducted by the Roper organization. It has commentary by Hopkins, Jacob, and Westrom that sandwiches it. Then around that sandwich is wrapped with commentary by John Mack in the beginning and John Carpenter at the end. And both are clinical therapists who are offering their clinical and scientific credentials to this work. And then that, in turn, is contained or wrapped by commentary by Robert Bigelow. So it's Bigelow, and then there's credentialed people, and then there's the Hopkins, Jacobs, Westrom talking about who's actually writing the clinical depiction and therapy recommendations. And then around in the center is the Unusual Events Survey that has the data that we're actually talking about. So it's a rather complex and kind of nested doll type situation. I need to read this note from the publisher. This is from Robert Bigelow. This survey to mental health professionals presents the combined data from 3 national surveys of nearly 6,000 adult Americans. It is the collective effort of a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, John Mack, a professor of sociology at Eastern Michigan University, Ron Westrom, an associate professor of history at Temple University, that is David Jacobs, a psychiatric therapist in Springfield, Missouri, John Carpenter, and an author and researcher from New York City, that's Bud Hopkins, a large polling organization, that's the Roper Organization. The report has been funded by two interested individuals, Robert Bigelow and Hans Adam II, Prince of Liechtenstein. It is being published privately and independently by the Bigelow Holding Corporation, and that's important. And it will be mailed to nearly 100,000 psychiatrists, psychologists, and mental health professionals. Yes, that's 100,000 psychiatrists, psychologists, and mental health professionals. So that's really important to understand. John Mack then, in his introduction or commentary, really defines or introduces the syndrome as a traumatic thing. He defines it in terms of trauma. And I'll just highlight a few statements, right? So he says that their traumata, meaning the abductees, has 4 dimensions. And the first and last one's really important. So the first one says the physically and emotionally intrusive abduction phenomena themselves. So he's saying they're physically intrusive, meaning he's arguing for a physical alien abduction hypothesis. The intrusiveness also may be defined as fantastic sexual trauma, as we'll note in the later description here in this book, as well as the work of Hopkins, Jacobs, and Mack. I'll report on this. The last factor or the last dimension of traumata that's worth mentioning here is the fact that the trauma, whatever its source, is not over, i.e. abductees cannot prevent its recurrence or protect their children and other loved ones from its effect. So I'm saying here that he is arguing for physical alien abduction hypothesis and that we are powerless victims of this. Us and our children are. That's what he's saying here. He's not arguing for passport to the cosmos or his later shamanically based ideas or any of those new paradigm things. He's arguing that space aliens will physically come here, take our bodies, perform fantastic sexual trauma to them, and put us back, along with our children, and there's nothing we can do about that. I say that in context with a document sent out to 100,000 mental health practitioners and used as a basis to engage a mental health community, there should be some level of correction, and I'm really curious, has anyone released a statement regarding this, that sort of thing? So he says, above all, mental health clinicians should learn to recognize the most common symptoms and indications in the patient's client or client's history that they are dealing with an abduction case. It includes nightmares, dreams, phobias, all sorts of stuff, right? And so if you're interested, you can really get into that. But he says then, it's possible that after the showing of the intensely promoted CBS miniseries docudrama in May, which will treat the abduction phenomena with dramatic seriousness, great numbers of abductees and others who may fear that they are experiencers will turn to the mental health professionals in their anxiety or self-diagnosed concern. It's important that these clinicians have enough knowledge of the phenomena to respond properly. They need to be open to the possibility that something exists or is happening to their clients, which in a more traditional Western framework cannot or should not be. So it's basically saying, hey, the CBS miniseries was fiction based on Bud Hopkins and John Mack's research. And he's saying that we're not, like, people aren't actually responding to the actual traumatic events. He's not warning against that. He's warning against anxiety produced by television. And he's saying that that is a symptom for long forgotten trauma of space alien rape. That's what he's saying here. I know he's saying it in more elevated terms, but that's what the argument is here. So we need to talk about that. That's in part why I say this is pseudoscience and potentially harmful. We'll get into that more. All right. Next up, we have the UFO Abduction Syndrome. This is a report by Hopkins, Jacob, and Westrom. It talks about the survey, and it says, hey, 2% of the population likely are abductees. It talks about what abduction is in this introduction. It provides a clinical description. It talks about phobias and dreams and hypnosis and missing time and body marks and stuff like that. It presents a typical history where, one important point here is that they did a study with psychologists and abductees, and they found that the abductees were not particularly psychopathic, right? They had some indications of psychopathy, but those were not extraordinary or not, we're not dealing with schizophrenia or dissociative identity disorder or something like that primarily. It seems to be kind of sane people who are experiencing these things. And that's really echoed in like the 2014 Varieties of Anomalous Experience textbook by the APA, where Appel et al. Really confirmed the finding that it is not a symptom of psychopathy. So that's really important to note, even though we're dealing with false beliefs and fantastic sexual trauma narratives. It's not psychopathy. It's something else. And that's why I say it's actually an exotic dream phenomena, because we have all sorts of wild experiences happen to us in dreams and nightmares, and they aren't symptoms of psychopathy per se if you're dealing with fantastic beings who are doing traumatic things to you at night, right? It's only an issue when you take those out of their domain or specific phase of consciousness. And I say that's an interesting element of the abduction narratives. The authors go on to present a typical history of abductees in talking about scoop marks and missing time and that sort of thing. They bring in the example of some people. I don't need to go through that. We're all pretty familiar with that. They talk about hybridization, etc. So how widespread is the abduction phenomena? So they do some survey of the literature. They talk about polls a little bit, and then they talk about their survey. They go into the findings of their survey. Basically, they say they asked 10 indicated questions, 11 including a strange question regarding the word trondent, which is a made-up word that's offered as a positivity response bias. So if you say yes to the question, have you ever heard the word trondent and known it has a secret meaning for you, then they throw out your responses because they assume you're just saying yes to the questions. And in response, they had a number of people say yes, they've had an experience to one of the experiences, and only about 18 people reported all 5 experiences. So then they extrapolate that information to say that about 2% of the population, that's 3.7 million people, likely are abductees. From there, they go on to offer therapy recommendations, and they talk about how useful hypnosis is, and sometimes it's not useful, but generally this is discussed within the context of a therapy session. They're talking to mental health practitioners. They're offering advice for therapy sessions. So even if hypnosis per se is not used, I say that the methods that are typically associated with a myth of repressed memory are still active. Right? Using or not using hypnosis in an explicit way, I say, is not enough to elevate any inquiry out of concerns regarding myth of repressed memory. We have to talk about that one head on, basically. They talk about not denying the experience of the patient, that really affirming the reality is appropriate and an appropriate thing to do, and that sort of thing. So then they go into about the authors. They offer literature and source material. Please note there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 6 references here. By the way, there are at least 6 peer-reviewed papers about hypnosis. There's 6 peer-reviewed papers about sleep paralysis or dreams. There's even literature about out-of-body experiences. So this reference at that time of publication, there's likely probably an order of magnitude more available peer-reviewed literature about related phenomena than what's offered here. And I think that's really important to note. So then it goes into the unusual events survey finding conducted for the Roper organization, Bigelow Holding Corporation by the Roper organization. And they go through and talk about the indicators. They talk about the overall findings. Then they get to a really interesting part to me. They say that when compared with known demographic segments, it appears that abductees are influential Americans. They're trendsetters. They make more money. They are associated with a known demographic from the Roper organization called the influential Americans. And this document basically says to me, if you want to be an influential American, you might as well say you're an abductee, because abductees are the movers and shakers. They're smarter, they're more educated, and they're wealthier. So I think of this part in addition to the question regarding Trondant, right? Trondant. If I think about that and I go, this feels like a MK Ultra style social engineering document to me, and that's one of the threads of interpretation I've been playing with, is whether or not this document was intentionally crafted for intentional social engineering purposes. Right? There's a weird Trondant. That's like a code word or something like that, as well as this association with influential Americans, as well as this sort of kind of aggressive misappropriation of what is arguably a natural dream phenomenon into this really extraordinary kind of abduction experience. So I thought perhaps this was constructed by a conspiracy or an evil cabal of people, that Bigelow and all the others are in on it, and this is a social engineering document. I actually don't say that anymore, but I just need to name that because I think this document is highly strange, just like the phenomena it purports to study. So then the Roper organization concludes their survey and then concludes their findings. And then all of a sudden, we're into a methodology. And it's really not clear who wrote this. I believe it's Hopkins and Jacobs and Westrom at the point of writing about the methodology. No, excuse me, that's Roper. We get into, that's Roper because we're here. Here, this is the analysis of the survey results. We get into some analysis. Yeah, and that's where we get to the byline, the Hopkins, David, and Jacobs. So that was another part where I said, what's going on with this document? It feels as if, because we moved from these computer-generated finding tables from the Roper organization to the analysis of the survey results. And so there's no indication that we've moved from the Roper organization voice into the Jacobs, Westrom, and Hopkins voice. We just move into it, right? And so, of course, I mean, there's some reference to Jacobs and stuff like that, and it's like obvious once you dig into it, but it took me a while. It took me several readings to go, who's actually writing this? And so I felt as if there was almost a misappropriation or appropriation of the Roper organization voice into this even as well. So this sort of blends lines and categories and boundaries in a way that made me feel uncomfortable when I first approached this booklet. We get into the John Carpenter commentary. He identifies himself as a licensed clinical social worker working as a psychiatric therapist, providing individual, marital, family, and group therapy for hospitalized psychiatric patients. Right? He has a master's degree. He talks about all of his credentials, and he talks about why we should take this seriously. And I agree with him. We should take this seriously. Although the hypothesis of space alien abduction and fantastic sexual trauma narratives perpetuated in the physical waking reality by these beings, I say, is a pseudoscience that we need to address, and I'm addressing now. But it's important to know that that's what he talks about here. He's got a couple pages of all of the interpretation here, a lot of credentials. And then finally, we've got how this survey was designed by Hopkins and Jacobs, talking about their thoughts around the indicators, justifying it, and that sort of thing. So then finally, we have an afterword by Robert Bigelow, and he talks about why he funded this and what they're doing. And it's really important to note, I mean, I keep coming back to this too, because I think to myself, who is at, if unusual personal experiences is harmful pseudoscience, who's at fault? Well, obviously, I say the scientists who put their credentials to this work, and the clinicians, I say. So that's John Carpenter and John Mack. They put their letters to this document, and they endorsed it as representatives of medical and psychiatric and sort of clinical science. So that's what they're saying in their endorsement. But then who's responsible? Well, I say it's in part Robert Bigelow, who funded and produced this document and mailed it to 100,000 mental health practitioners. So why did he do that? And so he really says, to satisfy his own curiosity, he decided between naps to promote the idea of a nationwide survey that might produce some form of measurement of this phenomena. And he talks about establishing a budget with the Prince of Liechtenstein to do this. He says this effort was initiated without any expectation of unique results, but now that apparently unexpected results have occurred, and that's the like high prevalence rates of these phenomena, I feel it is important that additional surveys and other research be implemented. We did not fund this project for profit from sale of material, nor for any monetary gain, media involvement, or publicity, quite the opposite. But we strongly feel that it is important for the psychiatric community to consider the information and have the opportunity to conduct its own inquiry. I think that is what his motivation was, which is why I say it's not necessarily pseudoscience. If we keep holding this document as a definitive document, if we keep turning back to it as a definitive document, like John Mack did in 1994 when he cited its numbers in Oprah, then it is pseudoscience, because even at that point he received criticism about that people know that this survey wasn't supportive of the physical alien abduction hypothesis. So I'm saying that the evaluation of this document as a harmful pseudoscience is a complex one that needs to be interpreted within the context of subsequent research as well, and how it was used by the best-selling authors of those abduction books. Right? How did they use that? Did they use that to substantially improve their sales of books? Did they use it as a starting place or like a hypothesis or something like that? So I say this is a complex interaction or evaluation, in that this document and Robert Bigelow's motivations are kind of central to understanding it as well. Finally, we get to the last page where there's a mail-in card, like a postcard you can mail in to say you're interested in attending a lecture. Apparently, Bigelow did run a couple years or a few years of these conferences where he engaged with mental health community to talk about this phenomena. So that's the Unusual Personal Experiences booklet. So let's get back to the presentation. So I'm going to offer some kind of conclusions or provisional conclusions as a sort of halfway point of finding our way. So the belief in alien abduction narratives is associated with the lived experience of extraordinary phenomena such as UAP. I keep coming back to this, and this is essential. This is essential to understanding what we're talking about here. People have lived experiences that they are seeking explanation for, and they come to the abduction narrative. So there's a lived experience that cannot be denied, even if the physical alien abduction hypothesis is demonstrated to be absurd. There's an intuition of ET-NHI encounters. People are saying that these are ET-NHI encounters. That is associated with hypnotic suggestibility, so that's important to know. False memories, schizotypy yet not psychopathy. And yes, I'm using the term schizotypy primarily because it's used in the literature. I find terms like that to be somewhat offensive, and I would rather us use a model of neurodivergence or something like that than personality disorder. Even in the literature, though, it's important to note that schizotypy is not all the time defined as a personality disorder. So there's ambiguity there. The belief is associated with a history of debate regarding the physical reality of supernatural entities, often associated with fantastic sexual trauma. That this means that the alien abduction discussion is an iteration of a conversation we've been having since medieval witch hunting days. The medieval witch hunters would look at body marks for evidence that supernatural beings, imps, or devils would come to the witch and suckle lifeblood from them. This is very similar to how Zeta Reticulan doctors come and steal genetics, leaving marks so that the Zeta race or whatever can be sustained by the lifeblood, let's say, of humans. So belief in alien abduction trauma may actually generate fear, anxiety, and PTSD similar to consciously experienced historic trauma. That is supported by a couple peer-reviewed papers by multiple scientists. So that's kind of a more solid conclusion here about abduction than anything else we're talking about. So the provisional conclusions at this point are: the lived experience of abduction is likely as described by abductees, therefore it deserves our respect and reverence. The physical alien abduction hypothesis and rape by space aliens may be a unreasonable hypothesis, although there may be physical side effects, and there's highly strange physical side effects, and that is, I say, one of the reasons why we should consider this to be a unique phenomena, not just sleep paralysis, not just out of body, but something else, because there are highly strange physical manifestations of this experience. The ET-NHI encounter likely arises from a complex and non-dual interaction between the experiencer and the non-human intelligence, similar to dreams. So just like in dreams or hypnosis, the experience arises in an interplay between the personal unconscious and something transpersonal, or the personal subconscious and the hypnotist, or whatever. There's an interaction, a participation, a co-creation. So too, I say that the actual underlying phenomena of abduction is co-creative and non-dual with beings that we have termed ET and NHI. Attitudes, intention, and mindfulness. Attitudes, intention, and mindfulness may shift unwanted experiences, providing insight into the nature of experiences, and may mediate individual and collective fortune. These are my arguments from dream studies. If ET-NHI encounters and hypnosis is dreamlike, then we know that attitudes, intention, and mindfulness may shift those unwanted nightmarish experiences. That's really the point of this. The point of going through all of these documents is to say, hey, the thing that we thought was alien abduction is actually something like a special type of dream. Even though we don't understand this one special type of dream, we do know about dreams in general, and we know that you are capable of working with them and shifting them. You are not a powerless victim, and that's really what this is about. Alien Abduction Believer Syndrome is a satire of the UFO Abduction Syndrome as defined in Unusual Personal Experiences. I'm putting forward a syndrome definition as a satire of the UFO Abduction Syndrome defined in the Unusual Personal Experiences booklet. I'm saying that because this is important for you to know. I'm not a clinician. I'm not doing science in that way. I'm writing a literary satire. I am doing that because I believe using the same form and kind of language as the original authors of this booklet, that will help bridge into this new understanding. I think it will help me speak to the people who Unusual Personal Experiences actually spoke to. UFO Abduction Syndrome is highly unlikely. You do not need to be afraid of psychic space aliens who might kidnap you to perpetuate fantastic sexual traumas for unknown medical purposes. I wish someone would have said that to me when I was a kid, or I mean, it's just you're trying to figure something out when you have these experiences, and extraordinary hypotheses seem reasonable because your experience was extraordinary. So I wish someone would have just said, hey, it's pretty unlikely, right? But instead I saw really smart, charismatic people advocate for alien abduction hypotheses. And I thought, well, that seems reasonable to me. I mean, I have a lived experience of this extraordinary visitation phenomena and extraordinary experiences. So that's really something I keep coming back to. It's unlikely. We don't need to be afraid of being kidnapped by psychic space aliens who traumatize bodies. We do need to be afraid of nightmares or whatever if we're not working with them, right? So there are really intense experiences. I'm not denying any of those, but I'm saying that ultimately we have some degree of power to mediate those experiences. Alien abduction is likely a special type of dream phenomena like sleep paralysis or false awakening. Therefore, you can work with it. You are not a powerless victim. You are a powerful dreamer. And I'll read that again. Alien abduction is likely a special type of dream phenomena like sleep paralysis or false awakening. Therefore, you can work with it. You are not a powerless victim. You are a powerful dreamer. And I'll say the phenomena measured by the Unusual Personal Experience poll, often termed the Unusual Events Survey, is real and worth studying. And I say that that is the special type of dream phenomena we call alien abduction. I say there's science actually done. I say those numbers are good. And I say we need to clear out any absurdity related to the physical alien abduction hypothesis in order to really engage science on those meaningful numbers that are coming through the unusual personal experiences poll. So now I will read my writing, which is the Alien Abduction Believer Syndrome. Let me just get to that. Right. Alien Abduction, BS, Believer Syndrome. Abstract. A new interpretation of the UFO Abduction Syndrome defined in the 1992 Unusual Personal Experiences booklet in the context of subsequent research suggests that there is a syndrome associated with belief in alien abduction that may manifest in false memories, paranoid thoughts, fear, anxiety, and PTSD. This report defines the Alien Abduction Believer Syndrome, AABS, and identifies its cause in two epistemological fallacies, the myth of repressed memory and the monophasic bias. AABS appears to affect two populations, abductees, now termed experiencers, and those who integrate abductee testimony into their worldviews. It is estimated that there are tens of thousands of abduction reports. 60% of the population believes in the myth of repressed memory, and nearly 80% believe that the government may cover up signs of alien visitation. While the original abduction researchers advocated for the disempowering reality of abduction trauma, this report argues for empowering reality that abduction events are both dreamlike and real, thereby advocating that the experiencer is capable of mediating their ETNHI encounter phenomena for their benefit. Additional resources and research for further inquiry is indicated. This document is crafted as a literary satire on the Unusual Personal Experiences booklet and should not be considered a clinical argument. Introduction. While the claim that UFO abductions occur in the objective sense is extraordinary, the claim that belief in UFO abductions has objective impacts is not extraordinary because there are scientific studies that demonstrate the belief in alleged alien abduction narratives as trauma has similar effects as genuine trauma, e.g. PTSD, anxiety, and disassociation. Efforts to inform mental health professionals about the reality of long-forgotten traumatic encounters with aliens may have, ironically, created the very harm they sought to alleviate. This report argues that the UFO Abduction Syndrome, defined within the 1992 Unusual Personal Experiences booklet, may be a harmful pseudoscience. This report mirrors that booklet in its presentation of a syndrome definition, the Alien Abduction Believer Syndrome, which is defined as the harmful belief in traumatic alien abduction narratives. Claims related to the UFO Abduction Syndrome were primarily derived from first-person testimony generated directly through hypnosis or indirectly through interaction with researchers. In either case, the hypnotist or researcher acts as an interlocutor, generating objective testimony regarding arguably subjective events. The process of interlocution to generate legal testimony regarding supernatural events has its historic roots in medieval witch hunts, in which priests would use complex epistemologies to convict innocent people of demonic interactions. The generation of false memories of alien abduction primarily occurs through hypnosis, but may occur outside of hypnosis within the context of a relationship with an interlocutor, like a therapist. While many researchers have written on alien abduction as a hypnotic false memory and reject the phenomena as worthy of scientific investigation, this report documents the observation that alien abduction narratives may have real-world consequences and may be a misappropriation of real-world, albeit dreamlike, events associated with ETNHI and counterintuitions. First, this report observes that the adoption of the UFO abduction syndrome as an identity through the integration of alien abduction false memories may produce psychophysiological symptoms akin to genuine trauma like PTSD. Second, this report argues that alien abduction phenomena may be an exotic dream phenomena similar to sleep paralysis, with potentially strange physical manifestations like stigmata or apports, the study of which may have been obscured by the absurdities of the abduction narratives. This document is informed by its author's books, Missing Time Found, which presents the shamanic dreaming hypothesis of missing time, and Galathog the Gray's Field Guide to Anomalous Geometry, which is an integral inquiry into the use of anomalous body marks as physical evidence for alien abduction. Description. The UFO Abduction Syndrome defined abduction primarily in terms of negative emotions about dreams and concern regarding missing time. The UFO Abduction Syndrome authors suggested that emotional dreams regarding strange figures, medical procedures, and experiences of paralyzation are symptoms of the syndrome. The authors defined 10 indicators of the syndrome, which both skeptical and credulous researchers critiqued as inconclusive for abduction, and likely indicators of sleep paralysis. Researchers like Hopkins, Bullard, and Mack identified similar stages typical of abduction, such as kidnap, medical examination, and prophetic messaging. All researchers associated with the UFO abduction syndrome observed that belief in alien abduction narratives is not typically associated with psychopathy, which is an observation confirmed by subsequent researchers like Clancy and Appel et al. Belief in alien abduction narratives has been associated with fantasy proneness, suggestibility, and schizotypy by researchers. Newman and Baumeister hypothesized that alien abduction narratives may be adopted for similar reasons as masochistic fantasies, pointing to the trait of fantasy proneness as explanatory. Lin and Kirsch argued that abduction memories may be adopted for complex reasons within the context of therapy, not just hypnosis, and argued against the importance of fantasy proneness in the adoption of false memories, and also noting its link to UFO narratives. Clancy et al. Observed links between those reporting abduction with hypnotic suggestibility, depressive symptoms, and schizotypal features through false recognition and recall. McNally et al. Reported that abductees scored higher than controls on absorption, disassociation, and magical ideation measures. Belief in alien abduction narratives has also been associated with demonstrable psychophysiological effects. McNally et al. Found that the belief that one has had a traumatic abduction may produce similar psychophysiological effects as those produced by remembering trauma, like combat. Latore and Vasilica surveyed a group of 19 abductees, observing that their emotional reaction to implausible experience is similar to a genuine traumatic event. Further, if the underlying experience of alien abduction is dreamlike, then we may expect that attitudes towards the experience may predict subjective well-being measures, just like attitudes towards dreams. Therefore, one may argue that the consolidation of alien abduction false memories as trauma that informs a person's identity may actually prevent well-being and cause PTSD. Epistemological fallacies. It is natural for professionals to assume that alien abduction reports are either veridical testimonies or else false memories. The phrase, too real to be a dream, yet too dreamlike to be real, expresses the paradox of abduction testimony, which may explain the polarized response of the scientific community to the UFO abduction syndrome. The paradox may arise from a complex interaction of two epistemological fallacies. First, the myth of repressed memory describes the fallacy that hypnosis or other therapy techniques may reliably recover repressed memories of long-forgotten trauma like alleged abduction events. The myth was exposed by Ketchum and Loftus in their 1994 book and confirmed by Otkar et al. In their 2019 review article. Second, the monophasic bias, which unduly privileges the waking phase of consciousness as the only real phase, as opposed to sleeping, dreaming, and altered states of consciousness. The monophasic bias is similar to Wilber's quadrant absolutism, which is a fallacy that gives undue privilege to subjective, objective, individual, and collective aspects of knowledge. The statement, too real to be a dream, represents the monophasic bias, which suggests that the potent dream experiences causing abduction intuitions must be explained through waking phase events, in turn establishing the expectation that a waking phase historical event must have occurred that was subsequently forgotten. This statement, to dream like to be real, represents the myth of repressed memory, in that the testimony derived from hypnosis has fantastic and non-veridical aspects that skeptics rightly observe discredit such testimony as physical evidence. Therefore, it is essential for skeptical researchers to become familiar with a monophasic bias and credulous researchers to become familiar with the myth of repressed memory. If both fallacies are addressed in research, then the underlying phenomena causing abduction reports may be directly studied. AABS sufferers. AABS has two typical sufferers, abductees and those who integrate their testimonies into their worldview. First and most obvious are those who believe they were abducted by aliens. Most researchers suggest that inexplicable events like UAP sightings or intense and strange dreams inspire experiencers to seek explanation, which they typically seek through missing time regression therapy or alien abduction literature. The abductees, now typically called experiencers, adopt their identities through the integration of recovered memory or worldviews involving alien abduction. Some experiencers share their testimonies of alien abduction to inform the public about the possibility of abduction and the efficacy of hypnotic regression. All reported cases of alien abduction obviously involve both an experiencer and an interlocutor, like a reporter or researcher. Scholars of religion like Pasolka have noted the similarity of abduction testimonies with religious testimony, including themes of conversion, visitation, dreams, visions, prophecies, and miraculous appearance of supernatural light. While their testimonies are often supported with documentation and corroborated witnessing, they rarely present the physical evidence one would expect for physical encounters. Given the examples of shared hallucination and dream reality confusion, it would appear that the physical aspect of abduction is not supported by evidence or literature review. Therefore, the adoption of the physical abduction hypothesis must be considered like a doctrine of faith within a religious community. The resolution of abduction tales into inexplicable experiences interpreted through belief is aptly characterized by Clancy's 2005 book title, Abducted: How People Come to Believe They Were Kidnapped by Aliens. This type of sufferer may be regarded as a first-generation AABS victim, typically involving first-person subjective perspectives. The second type of AABS sufferers are those who integrate abductee testimonies into their worldviews, but do not adopt the abductee identity themselves. Contemporary UAP crash retrievals and disclosure narratives may exemplify this second type of AABS sufferer. The contemporary UAP disclosure narratives appear to be directly informed by alien abduction epistemologies. Contemporary disclosure narratives are defined by two news articles. First, a 2017 news article written by Cooper, Keene, and Blumenthal established UAPs as a legitimate subject of serious conversation. The article reported on the secret government UAP study with Bigelow under the ATIP program. Second, a 2023 debrief article by Blumenthal and Keene introduced Grush, the so-called UFO whistleblower who alleged under oath that the government has UAP craft and alien biologics in their secret possession. Both articles were written by Keene, a former lover and protege of abduction researcher Hopkins, and Blumenthal, the biographer of abduction researcher Mack. Further, claims made by Mack's lawyer, Danny Sheehan, suggests that Sheehan directly influenced the drafting of the UAP Disclosure Act of 2023 and that he was unaware of the myth of repressed memory epistemological fallacy. Therefore, one may argue that all those impacted by contemporary UAP disclosure narratives suffer from AABS. This type of sufferer may be regarded as a second-generation AABS victim, typically involving third-person cultural perspectives. Both types of AABS sufferers integrate identities characterized by disempowerment and victimization caused by external mysterious others. Abductees are victimized by space aliens who have control over their bodies and minds, as well as their memory. Contemporary disclosure narratives assume that there is a hidden faction of the government that is actively controlling many aspects of society in order to keep ET UFO narratives hidden while using advanced technology re-engineered from UAPs to maintain victimizing control over the public. Given the Given that script-driven imagery of trauma causes similar psychophysiological effects as genuine trauma, and that attitudes about our dreams impact our well-being, one could argue that the disempowering themes of alien abduction produce unnatural and undue harm. The Free survey observed that while some experiencers initially view their experience as negative, most experiencers of ET/NHI contact come to view their experience as positive. Therefore, the themes of victimization and disempowerment may be understood as a religious doctrine and not scientific observation, which may cause harm through its interpretation of natural experiences that may otherwise be neutral or positive. A typical history. It may be useful to discuss typical AABS history. Most abduction researchers discuss typical histories from their unique perspectives. For example, the credulous authors of Unusual Personal Experiences focused on dreams, memories, and trace evidence of abduction episodes, while skeptical researchers focused on the generation of false memories through hypnosis like Lynn and Kirsch. Rainey describes several cases from Hopkins and Jacobs that clearly violated research ethics and integrity, which may be seen as extremely acute cases of AABS. A typical experiencer's history may have several phases. First, anomalous experience. Second, seeking for an explanation. Third, adoption of alien abduction belief systems. And fourth, the production of alien abduction testimony. While the typical history of a first-generation AABS sufferer, an abductee or experiencer, is well documented, the typical history of a second-generation AABS sufferer, a believer, is not well documented for two reasons. First, the connection between early 1990s abduction research and UAP disclosure narratives is not yet well known. Second, abduction narratives arose along with TV and internet technologies, which created an unprecedented situation. AABS involves unconscious epistemological fallacies, therefore it is impossible to fully understand the phenomena until retrospection occurs, by which the fallacies become conscious. Since UAP disclosure narratives are prevalent in media and government, it may be argued that our culture is as of yet unaware of the fallacies. Therefore, the presentation of a typical history for the second generation or cultural sufferer of AABS will occur only after a period of collective retrospection. How widespread is the alien abduction believer syndrome? There are several ways to estimate the prevalence of alien abduction believer syndrome. First, one could count the number of published abduction tales in literature or reporting centers. Appel et al. Observed that Bullard included 270 tales in his 1987 survey and found that major abduction researchers in 1994 held over 1,700 case files. A survey of updb.app for the word abduction, which indexes all reports from the major UFO reporting centers, yields around 3,900 total reports, with around 1,000 in the last 10 years. Appel et al. Also noted that Strieber received over 55,000 letters in response to his book Communion before 1995. His book Communion, by the way, sold around 2 million copies very quickly. So another way to estimate AABS prevalence would be to count membership in social groups related to abduction. As of March 2024, the subreddit Alien Abduction has around 20,000 members. The Experiencers subreddit has 50,000. The Alien subreddit has 857,000 members. And the UFO subreddit has 2.8 million members. The Experiencer group, which has an application and a vetting process, has over 1,000 members. Contact in the Desert is said to be the largest UFO conference with around 3,000 attendees in 2019, and in 2024 appears to have 70 presenters. Polls and surveys provide another way to estimate prevalence of AABS. The Free survey questioned around 4,000 experiencers. The Unusual Personal Experiences booklet surveyed around 6,000 people, estimating that 2% of the population may suffer from the UFO Abduction Syndrome. A National Geographic survey in 2012 found that around 10% of people reported seeing a UFO. Around 36% believe alien spacecraft have visited Earth. 77% believe there are signs of alien visitation on Earth. And 79% believe that the government could hide signs of alien life. A repeated Gallup poll found that in 2019 that 33% of people believe that some UFOs are alien spacecraft, which increased 8 points to 41% in 2021. Therapy. It is clear from the continued prevalence of abduction and UFO tales, along with the growing belief in the myth of repressed memory, that AABS may be an emerging and persistent syndrome within Western culture. The Unusual Personal Experiences authors recommended hypnosis in the context of therapy, with special attention to not deny the reality of hypnotically induced recollections of long-forgotten trauma of space alien abduction and sexual violation. If most alien abduction experiences may resolve into dreamlike phenomena, then it is unreasonable and unnecessary to make therapy recommendations, except in acute cases. Under the shamanic dreaming hypothesis of missing time, it is understood that every dreamer is universally capable to mediate their own dream encounters for their own benefit, which is a principle of shamanic dreaming. If AABS is caused by the two epistemological fallacies of the myth of repressed memory and the monophasic bias, then it may be alleviated through research and education from perspectives that address these fallacies, namely integral theory and dream studies. The alleviation of these fallacies may change our language, such as from shifting the term regression to dream work, and removing the metaphor of memory from hypnotic testimony. ET-NHI encounters may still be reported, and hypnosis may still be used to provide insight and resolution to these experiences. The shift of language and concepts may help the abductee integrate a view of themselves that is empowering rather than disempowering. The shift of language and epistemology may build trust between the public and the government, because it would no longer necessitate a conspiracy to explain the lived experience of ET-NHI contact and the surprising lack of physical evidence for it. More research on AABS is needed to make a clinical description or therapy recommendations. This document is a literary emulation or satire of the UFO Abduction Syndrome article in the 1992 Unusual Personal Experiences booklet and does not constitute a clinical or therapeutic statement, although its references may be useful in such a statement. While some research associates belief in alien abduction narratives with the adoption of PTSD akin to memories of physical trauma, the degree of harm, if any, caused by AABS has not been estimated or measured. Most research up to this point has assumed that alien abduction was either a dream or it was real, but not both. If the shamanic dreaming hypothesis is accurate, then ET-NHI encounters may be both dreamlike and real, and therefore may respond to both intention and attitudes. The author has produced a proposal for a research institute that would produce an accredited dissertation on the subject and a program to engage mental health professionals regarding the dreamlike reality of ET-NHI encounters. Consequently, it may be expected that research and education regarding epistemological fallacies in alien abduction and UAP crash retrieval narratives may have a direct impact on the experience and cultural understanding of the phenomenon. About the author. Daniel Rekshan, M.A., Ch.T., author. Daniel Rekshan is a PhD student in Integral Noetic Sciences at the California Institute for Human Sciences. He has a master's degree in East-West Psychology from the California Institute of Integral Studies and is certified in the spiritual counseling modality of depth hypnosis. He is the author of Missing Time Found, which presents the shamanic dreaming hypothesis of missing time, and Galathog the Gray's Field Guide to Anomalous Geometry, which examines body marks as physical evidence for alien abduction. He is an experiencer of many of the key indicators of the UFO Abduction Syndrome and is a survivor of the Alien Abduction Believer Syndrome. He can be contacted by writing to daniel@dseti.org. Wonderful. So getting back to the presentation, I just need to come back to the facts, right? So we've gone through a journey of looking at the UFO Abduction Syndrome in the Unusual Personal Experiences booklet. We've talked about it. Then we've read through my syndrome definition, the Alien Abduction BS Believer Syndrome, which was an emulation or satire of that document. But I really need to come back to some facts that are very, very essential to my argument here. And these are the facts that can serve as a scientific basis for the exploration of alien abduction narratives and their underlying phenomena. And these facts are the results of that unusual events survey poll. Right? Nearly one adult in five has waken up paralyzed with a sense of strange figure or presence in the room. Nearly one adult in 8 has experienced a period of an hour or more in which he or she was apparently lost but could not remember why. 1 in 10 has felt the experience of actually flying through the air without knowing how or why. 1 adult in 12 has seen unusual lights or balls of light in a room without understanding what was causing them. 1 adult in 12 has discovered puzzling scars on his or her body without remembering how or where they were acquired. So those are the facts. I mean, they repeated the poll twice. We have robust numbers on this over a decade or a decade and a half. So I think it's really worth studying what's going on here. They're broken down by demographics. It's collected by a robust polling organization and is indicatory of something really incredible. Now, my hypothesis at this point, since we do need hypotheses, is mirroring that of Paul Devereaux, right? And in the 80s, there was this alien abduction hypothesis, but other people were saying, hey, something else seems to be going on. And Paul Devereaux was one of those. He said that there was probably this sort of Earth-lights thing happening, a ball lightning or plasma or something like that emerging from geomagnetic or tectonic activity, something like that. And that the ball lightning had a magnetic effect on the brain, which produced these dreamlike experiences. Now, I say actually it looks primarily like a visitation of a masterful dream shaman, right? So this figure can generate, there's a generation of a shared dreaming state. There's a sense of control of the dream. There's also this sense of reality that requires interpretation. Now, these are all the characteristics of shamanic dreaming that are listed by scholars in the peer-reviewed paper, What Can We Learn from Shamans Dreaming? So there's characteristics, and I say those characteristics seem to be present in all the interactions with these entities. And therefore I say it seems like a visitation of a masterful dream shaman. Now, if we're looking for a physical body in this experience, we can either look at the strange figures in the room or something like that, or we can dive into or focus on the balls of light. We do that connects us with this kind of vast system of phenomena. The crop circles are associated with balls of light, human-initiated contact experiences, light orbs, angels, will-o'-the-wisps. And so all of a sudden we're starting to see that perhaps these figures of strange light can act as something like strange dream shaman, producing multiple layers of experience. We call these screen memories in the past, but I say actually they're not screening for anything, that they're meaningful in and of themselves, and that perhaps that is our evidence of encounters with these beings or something like that. Now, I don't know if anything's happening physically beyond a dream scenario, but it seems like something is to me. The balls of light are interesting, the scars on the body, the kind of complex of this highly strange physical manifestations. And that's one of the things we need to keep coming back to, is that there are complexes of anomalies associated with these encounters that really are inexplicable by other phenomena like sleep paralysis or shared hallucinations. So something really is going on. And if we think of it like evidence for space alien visitation, we are throwing away a lot of data. And that's why I keep coming back to this document, because on the one hand, it presents a very strong definition of the UFO abduction syndrome. On the other hand, it presents a really strong data that something is happening. Therefore, I say it is both an example of harmful pseudoscience and perhaps very robust science at the same time. So how's that for a sense of complexity and high strangeness associated with the research regarding complex and highly strange phenomena? So I need to reflect on my omens. So I talked about a trap mouse, which was all about this notion that trap mouse was this argument for or against physical alien abduction hypothesis. I had trapped it with my questions regarding, is it reasonable to believe in UFO abduction syndrome? And it kept flopping this way and that way. And my wife said, you should drown that mouse. I said, yeah, I probably should have. And I produced some arguments, I think, that would have really killed that mouse in the metaphor in the past. But I refined my argument over and over and again. I say, actually, the sense of taking the mouse to the forest and simply releasing him, which is what I did, is what is called for here. And I think I've achieved that in this iteration of a presentation, in this iteration of the Alien Abduction Believer Syndrome. No need to kill anything. No need to fight. The only thing that really is being invited is the transmutation of suffering into joy and creativity. So that's how I refined my argument. I took that omen, and that omen was associated with a bridge, and it's driving towards compassion. But the bridge I'm saying here, so there were three omens: trap mouse, the suffering into joy and creativity, and the bridge. And so I because I've been reading Thomas the Tank Engine with my son, and there are characters named like Birdie the Bus, Harold the Helicopter, Thomas the Tank Engine, I thought, Bigelow the Bridge. And so I just started thinking about that, Bigelow the Bridge. Who's the bridge? And I say it is Robert Bigelow, because he funded the alien abduction research in the early 90s. He received the $22 million in the ATIP program to study UAPs and other paranormal things at Skinwalker Ranch, and kicked off this modern UAP crash retrieval and disclosure narrative situation. Really, he's at the heart of it. And I was terrified of him, actually, terrified of the book Unusual Personal Experiences, because of its sort of feeling as a social engineering document, and intentionally, like I thought, some group of people intentionally got together and intentionally said, let's take the phenomena of exotic dream encounters or sleep paralysis, and let's make a complex out of it. And I thought, either it was social engineering, or I thought he knew that if he created so many consistent dreams of Zeta Reticulans abducting people, that perhaps the whole complex of Americans dreaming together about abduction might produce strange phenomena, right? Blurrings of reality. They may actually produce more encounters, like how some people say, like Slender Man, or these sort of folklore things that are now coming into reality. He might be like operationalizing that to, my thought was produce apports, which are physical objects transferred from other dimensions or something like that. The spiritualists, the mediums, they do that with like cut gems. And then Krippner said, hey, there are examples of dream apports. Like he cited the example of someone who dreamt they were in a tropical beach and woke up with tropical beach sand, even though it was like winter or something in England, something like that. So there's like this transport, this magical teleportation of objects. And I thought, oh, perhaps he's consistently creating a sense of consistent nightmare of alien abduction, so that somehow it clicks together of our population to start making these apports of UFOs, and he'd go retrieve them and reverse engineer them. I thought that was my paranoid fantasy, let's say. So paranoid fantasy. So this whole argument is all about removing that sense of fear and paranoia from the lenses, right? So we have fear and paranoia about alien abduction. So these mysterious others from Zeta Reticuli or wherever they're coming from outside into our space, violating it in ways that are disempowering to us. The same thing with the UAP crash retrieval narratives. Like the mysterious covert government is sort of using advanced alien technology to maintain this victimizing control over us. And that also, I say, is fearful and disempowering. And so I thought, what would it look like if there was an argument that wasn't based in fear and paranoia around what happened with what I once called harmful pseudoscience. So I once called the UFO Abduction Syndrome and the UAP, the Unusual Personal Experiences booklet, harmful pseudoscience. And what if I approached it from a place of view that wasn't fearful and paranoid? Well, it's and so I started looking at Bigelow, and I was like, he's the guy. My projections on him will really show me where my understanding, where I'm at in this argument. And so I went to Bigelow Aerospace, went to get some more information about him, and I have this picture from his website, and there was a thing there that's very, very telling to me that made me trust the scenario and made me just throw away all the fear and paranoia as sort of an artifact of or growing pain of my inquiry. And the fact here is that Bigelow Aerospace produces inflatable habitats for like space stations and space programs and stuff like that. It's got a website that looks like it was made in WordPress. It looks like someone who doesn't care about web design made an adequate website. And under the main navigation, there's red text that looks like it was hacked in there. It looked like it was hacked in there by someone who just needed to put up this information and didn't really care what it looked like. And so the information says it's an advertisement for Bigelow's appearance on New Thinking Out Loud, which is a program run by Dr. Mishlev, the first parapsychology PhD. And this says, investigating the paranormal live stream event with Robert Bigelow on New Thinking Aloud, YouTube from 11 to 12:30, Sunday, September 10th. Ask your questions using YouTube chat and share the link to notify your friends and colleagues. And so he's advertising this interaction he's having with Dr. Mishlev. And this is like that. This is months ago. It is almost April. So this is like 7 months ago, something like that, or a year and 7 months ago. I'm not 100% sure. So this tells me that he cares a lot about his parapsychology research. He cares a lot about the paranormal research. In fact, so much so that he is advertising it on his aerospace page as opposed to his Consciousness Institute page. And further, it tells me he's not really looking back. He's not really looking back to address this. Like if, this was months ago, he hasn't corrected this. So if he hasn't corrected this, why would I expect him to think about correcting the pseudoscience, the potentially harmful pseudoscience of the UFO abduction syndrome? I don't think he would. I think he is moving forward with this exploration of the paranormal. And now I really need to say a few words about this sense of cult or cabal or evil plan. Stephen Greenstreet, I really appreciate his reporting. So Stephen Greenstreet alleges there's a UFO religion in Congress that is influencing situations, and it is doing so in a way that's not scientific. And I say, yeah, those critiques are very, very valid, right? It does look like a religion, and I think that's a very valid critique of the situation. And it looks to me, because of the new Arrow reports coming out, that we'll find there's no physical evidence for abduction and crash retrievals yet again. And that's some experts out there telling us. And we'll have a paranoid, fearful delusions telling us against that, and there'll be a little bit of a dialogue there. But I really wanted to reflect upon the pre-trans fallacy that's put forward by integral theorist Ken Wilber. And this is essential to understanding where we can go together and why and how pseudoscience can become science. It's through the pre-trans fallacy. So it's important to know that science and our activities of generating knowledge happen through multiple different perspectives. And even though it seems to be objective and repeatable and things like that for science, the kind of science that involved humans, it involves personal perspectives no matter what. And we can approach a number of phenomena from a variety of different perspectives. Typically in the West, in science, we approach it from a rational perspective. So from a rational perspective. So the pre-trans fallacy refers to pre-rational and trans-rational experiences or statements. Pre-rational might be fantasies of children or schizophrenics or something like that. Trans-rational might be the communication of prophecy through like saints or this sort of Stanislav Grof kind of exploration of the psyche using psychedelics and holotropic breathing. And there's a really big difference between pre-rational and trans-rational, except for the fact that when you're looking at from a rational perspective, both look crazy because you've not yet gone to understand what trans-rational means. You're using your example of pre-rational to understand everything trans-rational. So that's what I'm saying is happening here. We're looking at Bigelow's research from a rational perspective, and we're expecting to see rational things like physical evidence for physical alien abduction or physical evidence for the UFO crash. Now, I'm saying that the interpretation of physical alien abduction and physical craft is a kind of a rational perspective of these things. And that's really well and good, except for the fact that we are actually studying trans-rational things that involve complex workings of consciousness. And so when we're taking these trans-rational inquiries, which I say likely Bigelow was doing, maybe consciously or unconsciously, I'm not sure, but he's working at a trans-rational level. We're translating that inquiry into rational perspective and saying, this looks like a religion, it looks false, there's no evidence, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. But the other thing, so that's like Greenstreet's perspective. He's from a rational perspective complaining or pointing out that there's no rational physical basis for this. But we actually, as researchers and people who are consuming this material, need to expand our perspectives from just rational perspectives to trans-rational perspectives, and then look through the evidence and look through the research again. That I'm saying that might yield an understanding that the pseudoscience is actually science from different perspectives. That I'm saying that if we were to personally expand our understanding from rational perspectives to trans-rational perspectives, and everyone who's a researcher or consumer of this material can do that simply through mindfulness, through education, through practicing dreams, through expanding their own journey into the trans-rational, through a variety of means, whatever that is, that once we do that, we'll be able to then interpret or discern what's happening with the abduction reports and crash retrieval narratives that may actually reveal there's trans-rational phenomena and trans-rational science being done upon them. And somebody had to be first for us to get it right. That's really where I'm at with that. So I'm saying that the abduction hypothesis, the crash retrievals or whatever, were that provisional hypothesis that some people used even to bridge into these trans-rational inquiries. But we as a society need to do that now, is what I'm saying. And so that's why I say Bigelow the bridge, is because his work in the 90s, his work with ATIP perhaps will bridge us from this rational perspective into a new paradigm, a new worldview based upon these trans-rational understandings. And trans-rational might sound crazy, but it's really just around that sense of quantum mechanics, entanglement principle, uncertainty principle, and stuff like that coming forward. That's where we see trans-rational in a very objective science sort of way as well. So I'm saying that Bigelow may be the bridge between these paradigms, and his research may look different from different perspectives. And that's a consideration that I'm really holding now. So I want to say you can take action to make a difference. What is the action you can take? And I say practice dream work and mindfulness. I say you can do that on the Dreamwell app. I've put that together with a great team of people, and we really believe in it. But if you don't connect with it, you can just connect with mindfulness and dream work in whatever way you find meaningful, right? You don't need an expert to take you on that path. You just need to do it. And that's why our lessons are really simple. They're short and can take you through it on Dreamwell. You can get to that at dreamwellbewell.com or on the app and Play stores. You can explore DreamWork sessions with me. Again, if you don't like my voice or you don't like the way I work, you don't have to work with me. There's so many people that work with dreams. There's so many people that do hypnosis. I highly recommend the quantum healing hypnosis or the quantum healing traditions. I love those as a way of trans-rational inquiry, non-objective, that really we're not confused with the epistemologies that confused abduction research. So I say they're a great example of session to work with. And I offer Beyond Quantum Healing through my practice at D-SETI.org. You can imagine what it would be like to not be afraid of alien abduction. I wish someone would have invited me to do that when I was 15 years old and freaked out about the dreams I was having. What would it be like to not be afraid of alien abduction? What would it be like to know that you are, at least in some part, in control of the situation? Now, you might be in control of this situation like you're in control of your addictions or your grief process related to a loved one passing or something intense like that, because these experiences are nightmarish. They are intense. They are recurrent. They are involving all layers of our consciousness, from subconscious to superconscious. And so saying you're in control of it isn't saying your ego's in control of it. It says that you can work with these experiences to shift your unwanted abduction experiences, to find insight and transformation in your nightmarish experiences. That's all I'm saying. And that it takes the time it needs to, but you can actually do that. That's what I believe dream studies tells us. If these are dreamlike, then we can apply the insights of dream work to these experiences. I say do your inner child work to resolve unconscious fear patterns. That's what I'm doing here. I'm resolving my unconscious fear patterns I inherited as a sufferer of the alien abduction belief syndrome, let's say. I say you can educate yourself on the epistemological fallacy of the myth of repressed memory and the monophasic bias. I say you can share your truth and experience, but I say you don't need to reference abduction narratives. I see this oftentimes on social media where people are posting their dreams or dream encounters, and they post about a sentence or a paragraph of disambiguation from abduction. They say, this was kind of abduction, but it wasn't. And I think the reference to abduction actually provides a sense of legitimacy or authority of those testimonies, but that disambiguation shows me that people are experiencing something else other than physical alien abduction. Then finally, I would invite you to dream a more empowering narrative than abduction. One of my collaborators says, how can we move from abduction to induction? And I think that's a really beautiful wordplay there. So how can we dream a more empowering narrative than abduction? So I want to offer some reflections. I've been on quite a journey with this. Like I said, I have gone from suffering to, I hope, joy and creativity. I have worked and reworked and refined my arguments. This has taken dozens of hours, perhaps, in the last week or two. And I've done so I can come to a point of view where I can really say that I'm not afraid of the alien abduction narrative, nor am I afraid of an evil conspiracy or cabal of people doing harmful pseudoscience. And in fact, I will say that I will be likely the most outspoken proponent of the UFO Abduction Syndrome as a harmful pseudoscience and as both a science. And so I think that's where I'm at, where I can hold these two perspectives, where these experiences are real and a dream. The science is both harmful pseudoscience and empowering science, right? It's a paradox. These aliens are both other and self, right? So we need to learn how to hold those paradoxes, and that is through the practice of mindfulness and its application to our dreams and dreamlike experiences. I want to reflect a little bit on this journey, and I want to reflect a bit on the phrase, you get what you see. You get what you see. When I started working with UFOs and all these incredible stories, I became influenced by them. I was drawn away from myself into hypotheses, right? So I think a lot about this in terms of the ball of light phenomena, the UFO phenomena, the Foo Fighters thing. Oftentimes, right, we get this notion that there are flying saucer craft, and that perhaps, right, one of the even 5 observables is low visibility or observability or something like that, that they can cloak themselves and do things. And so you have this notion, right, or I had this notion that these balls of light, like the Foo Fighters, were actually that ball of light was somehow produced by this physical craft that looked something to be like a Nazi bell or an ARV or a flying saucer craft, and that all these balls of light are hiding this physical craft in which occupants are driving around or something like that. And debunking the UAP, the 2022 UAP at the Monroe Institute that was featured in Chris Bledsoe's UFO of God book, I really came to definitive understanding that that was a tumbling geosynchronous satellite, the Intelsat 29E. Thank you to Dr. Michael Earle of the Royal Canadian College, Military College. He identified that for me, and that made me realize, like, oh, actually, my sense of discernment, my feelings around that said, oh, that's a satellite, but actually the MUFON director and all these people are saying it's a UFO, so it has to be a UFO. It's probably a craft out there sensing in telepathy and sending us information back. But actually, it was just a geosynchronous satellite, synchronistic with a beautiful event. And I say, you get what you see. I say that synchronicity is miraculous. The stories that Bledsoe tells are incredible, and that there does seem to be like a light ball visitation phenomenon. But you get what you see. You get what you see. There's no UFO craft hidden in that ball of light. That's why I'm saying that around the UFOs, because we don't have evidence for them, but we have evidence that something incredible is happening. So why not look to that as a phenomenon in and of itself, right? The same thing with the abduction hypothesis, right? So we have the data of the unusual event survey, balls of light, scars on body, missing time, figure in room, all these things. And we look at that data and we think, oh, that has to be the effect of a physical body, a physical being, etc., etc. And we assume that there's something else there that's being hidden. So this notion of needing to generate an explanation for why something is hidden, I say that's a step of complexification that Occam's razor should just cut off, right? Like if you have a need for a vast conspiracy of cover up, of course conspiracies happen, but we need to base this in evidence from credible witnesses that have actual evidence, right? I mean, maybe there is a cover up happening, but ultimately I don't think it's about physical evidence of craft. It just doesn't seem reasonable to me to expect that the government can control every single manifestation of a craft, especially in context with the CE5 initiative or the human initiated contact movement. Is people are having these encounters. People are seeing these UAPs, and they're doing so at a rate that is almost impossible for a government to keep tamped down. So something else is actually happening. You go, the assumption that it needs to be a physical craft or physical body, we can just throw away and say, hey, there's something else here, and let's collect as much data as we can about it without trying to fit that data to a hypothesis that may or may not be relevant. So you get what you see. And I applied that, get what you see to UFOs. I applied it to alien abduction. And I even applied it to my analysis of the abduction research, and you get what you see. I went to Bigelow's website, and what did I see? I saw a driven, charismatic, and entrepreneurial person who really cares about parapsychology and is on this sort of trans-rational inquiry into the nature of these phenomena. And that's what I see. That I haven't seen any evidence of harmful pseudoscience in that way. I've seen people, John Mack's people, like I had this huge argument about John Mack as a harmful pseudoscientist, but I haven't really seen his people, the people he worked with, put him forward in the same way as like Hopkins or Jacobs. I haven't seen harm being testified to his his legacy, right? And therefore I say you get what you see, right? Like Hopkins and Jacobs were unethical researchers that seemed to be motivated by unconscious sexual kinks and money, right? And fame. And they tried their best with research, but they weren't researchers. One was a painter, one was a historian, and so you get what you see. They gave you bad science, right? John Mack is a much better scientist, much more trained, but he was also a believer in these things. So he produced a lot of work that was very grounded, wonderful. I love Passport to the Cosmos. I love Abduction, but also there's this sort of influence. He was influenced by Hopkins and Jacobs. He's a believer. He believed them just like he believes his experiencers. And so his legacy is this opening up to this wide range of trans-rational experience. And his legacy really is also bridging us into this new paradigm. And he started in one place, he ended in another. You get what you see. And he did not produce such wild testimonies as harm as Hopkins or Jacobs. And therefore we can start splitting apart who did what, when, and how, who's responsible for what. Doesn't actually matter. What actually matters is our capacity to discern what's happening now, what happened in the research, and where are we going, and how are we building this new paradigm together. Even Danny Sheehan, right? Even Danny Sheehan, I have had a number of videos about how he lied about John Mack and how he's perpetuating this harmful pseudoscience notion of the myth of repressed memory and propagating fear and paranoia. And I say all those things are accurate, but I also say that the kind of structure and movement in society is valuable, the sense for disclosure. And I also believe that once we start simply injecting information about these epistemological fallacies into the mental health professional community, into the academic communities, into discourse, once we start bringing those in and folding those in, that many of the people who are proposing this fearful, paranoid, almost deluded notion of the UAP crash retrievals will go, something actually is happening, I guess we don't need to physicalize it in this same way. I guess I can move and practice mindfulness and learn how to expand my inquiry so that these trans-rational modes of thinking and exploration will make more sense to me. And so I think we'll do that as a society and go, wow, actually, the government didn't need to disclose anything, but we needed to go on this journey of disclosure in order to see what was already in front of our eyes. Isn't that beautiful? And that's all about generating a new paradigm, a new way of seeing, which may actually be an old way of seeing. And that's one of the reasons why I say a new and old hypothesis of missing time. That's the subtitle of my book, Missing Time Found. And so I just want to say thank you for going on this journey with me. I really hope that the satire can bring light to a couple epistemology fallacies, a couple of things that we can sort of look at and then set aside to move and follow and go over this bridge, let's say, into a new paradigm together. So with that, I simply want to wish that you be well, and I wish that you dream well. May you be well, may you dream well.